The chain stretched across my property line at dawn on a Tuesday, thick steel links glinting in the early September sun. James Whitaker, 44, a civil engineer who'd surveyed half the county's infrastructure projects, stood in his driveway staring at the audacity. 3 months. 3 months since Patricia Brennan had moved in as the new HOA president, and she'd been escalating her power trips weekly. But blocking his creek ford, the private easement his family had used for 40 years, crossed a line even James hadn't anticipated. What Patricia didn't know was that the exhausted engineer she'd been targeting had built his career on property law and land surveys. And tonight, she was about to learn exactly what happens when you try to seize property from someone who literally wrote the county's easement documentation. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible justice stories. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a good person too far, the confrontation where power shifted completely, and the resolution where justice was finally served. The first outline reveals how a dedicated civil engineer watched his peaceful rural property become a battlefield. For 40 years, the Whitaker family had used a private creek crossing to access the back portion of their 15-acre plot. Then Patricia Brennan took over the HOA and decided that Country Charm needed suburban control. What started as petty complaints about his workshop evolved into something far more calculated, an attempt to cut off access to half his property by declaring his historic ford a common area violation. James tried reasoning, tried showing documentation, tried everything a reasonable person would do. But Patricia had decided that being HOA president meant she could rewrite history itself. The toll it took wasn't just frustration. It was watching a bully systematically try to destroy what his grandfather had built. The second outline captures the moment. Patricia made her fatal mistake. She didn't just block the ford with a chain. She called an emergency HOA meeting to formally seize it, invited the county inspector, and prepared documents claiming ownership. She wanted witnesses to her victory. Instead, she got witnesses to her humiliation. Because James didn't just bring his survey equipment, brought 117 years of property records that she never knew existed. The third outline delivers justice with the precision of a perfectly executed engineering project. Patricia discovered that threatening someone's property rights isn't just wrong, it's actionable. And when you target a civil engineer who specializes in land surveys, you don't just lose the battle. You lose your position, your credibility, and your standing in the community. Sometimes justice comes with legal fees, fines, and a very public reminder that titles don't grant you power over other people's documented rights. Here's exactly how it happened. James Whitaker had purchased his 15-acre property in Brookfield County 12 years ago, inheriting it from his grandfather, who'd homesteaded the land in 1908. At 44, James was a licensed civil engineer specializing in infrastructure and land surveys, a profession that demanded precision and an almost obsessive attention to detail. His days involved reviewing property boundaries for commercial developments, testifying as an expert witness in land disputes, and ensuring that every measurement could withstand legal scrutiny. His evenings involved retreating to his workshop on the back 5 acres, accessible only by crossing Willow Creek at the shallow ford his grandfather had established decades before residential development had even reached this area. The property was James's sanctuary, especially after losing his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. The workshop, the creek, the land, it was where he processed grief and found peace. The problem started the first week of June when Patricia Brennan, 52, a former retail manager who recently retired, was elected HOA president of the Brookfield Meadows development that had sprung up adjacent to James's property in 2015. Her first act was distributing a 23-page community standards enhancement initiative that James had initially found amusing. The HOA governed the 52 homes in the subdivision, not his grandfather's original homestead property, which predated the HOA's existence by 70 years. But Patricia had different ideas about jurisdiction. The first incident happened on June 18th. James returned from work to find a violation notice zip-tied to his mailbox, citing his workshop as an unapproved commercial structure and his creek ford as an unsafe water crossing requiring HOA approval. James had laughed initially, assuming someone had made an administrative error. He called Patricia that evening, politely explaining that his property wasn't part of the HOA and that his grandfather's ford was documented in the original 1908 county survey. Patricia's response chilled him. "All properties in this area fall under our purview now. Mr. Whitaker, we're reviewing your situation." She'd hung up before he could respond. 3 weeks later, on July 9th, James discovered Patricia had sent certified letters to his home and work address, demanding he cease using the unpermitted creek crossing and submit plans for community approval of his workshop renovation. The letters referenced HOA bylaws that had no legal authority over his property, but the escalation was clear. James spent that evening pulling his property deed, his grandfather's original survey from 1908, the updated survey from 1956, and his own professional survey completed when he purchased the property in 2013. Every document confirmed the same thing: his property boundaries, his water rights, and his easement across the creek were ironclad. The breaking point came on September 3rd. James had left for work at 7 in the morning, crossed the ford as he had thousands of times before, and headed to a job site 2 hours away. When he returned at 6:30 that evening, a heavy steel chain blocked the ford, padlocked the posts driven into the creek banks. A laminated sign wired to the chain read, "Private HOA property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." James sat in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the deliberate theft of his property rights. His workshop tools, his late wife's gardening shed, half his land, all suddenly inaccessible unless he drove 3 miles around on county roads and entered through his back gate, adding 40 minutes to every trip. James called the county sheriff that night. Deputy Martinez listened sympathetically, but explained that property disputes were civil matters, requiring attorneys and judges. "I'd recommend documenting everything and getting a lawyer, Mr. Whitaker." James tried calling Patricia directly. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice dripping with false politeness. "The HOA board voted. That crossing is a liability and potential common area. You'll need to submit proper applications." When James mentioned his documented easement, she laughed. "Your paperwork against our legal authority? Good luck with that." Then she hung up. James Whitaker spent the next 2 weeks doing what he did best: research, documentation, and preparation. He pulled every survey filed with the county since 1905. He reviewed HOA, incorporation documents, and boundary maps. He photographed the ford from every angle, documented his family's usage with old photographs dating back 50 years, and compiled a legal brief that would have impressed most property attorneys. If Patricia wanted to play jurisdiction games, James would show her what happens when you challenge someone who'd spent 20 years defining legal boundaries for a living. And on September 17th, when Patricia called an emergency HOA meeting to formally discuss community water access concerns, everything was finally ready. The emergency HOA meeting convened at 7 p.m. on September 17th in the Brookfield Meadows Community Center, a converted garage that smelled of stale coffee and old carpet. Patricia had sent formal notices to all 52 HOA households, and James noticed she'd also invited Kenneth Morrison, a county land inspector she'd apparently befriended. 23 homeowners attended, most looking confused about why they'd been summoned on a weekday evening. James arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a weathered leather satchel that had belonged to his grandfather and a modern survey case containing equipment worth more than Patricia's. Patricia called the meeting to order with the self-importance of someone who believed a title granted absolute authority. "We're here to address the unauthorized creek crossing being used by Mr. Whitaker," she announced, gesturing toward James as if he were an exhibit. As your HOA president, I've taken action to protect our community from liability and to reclaim what appears to be common area water access. She clicked through a PowerPoint presentation showing photographs of James's Ford, complete with red circles and arrows suggesting danger and neglect. James sat quietly through her 20-minute presentation, watching her build a case constructed entirely on assumption and authority. When she finished, she turned to Kenneth Morrison. Our county inspector has agreed to evaluate the situation and provide official documentation supporting the HOA's claim. Morrison, clearly uncomfortable, began shuffling papers. That's when James stood. Before Mr. Morrison provides any evaluation, I'd like to present some context. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who testified in depositions dozens of times. He opened his grandfather's satchel and removed a document protected in archival plastic. This is the original 1908 Brookfield County Survey map filed March 14th, showing the Whitaker homestead property boundaries. He placed it on the projection table, and the age document appeared on the screen behind him. Its careful pen and ink lines still perfectly legible. Patricia's expression shifted from smug confidence to uncertainty. That's over a century old and has no bearing on current HOA. Let me continue, James interrupted, his engineer's precision cutting through her bluster. He placed a second document on the projector. This is the 1956 resurvey completed by Brookfield County Engineering, confirming the same boundaries and specifically documenting the creek ford as a permanent easement on private property. Another document. This is the 2013 professional survey I completed when purchasing the property, certified and filed with the county recorder's office. He looked directly at Patricia. All three surveys, spanning 117 years, confirm identical findings. The creek ford U-block with a chain and claimed as HOA. Common area is located entirely on my private property, within my documented easement, and has been in continuous use by the Whitaker family since 1908. The room had gone completely silent. James continued, methodical and relentless. Patricia Brennan, you installed barriers on private property without permission. You claimed ownership of land you don't own. And you used your position as HOA president to intimidate me into surrendering documented property rights. He turned to Kenneth Morrison. Mr. Morrison, I'm a licensed civil engineer and certified surveyor in this county. Perhaps you could confirm whether a homeowners association formed in 2015 can claim jurisdiction over a property easement established in 1908, predating the HOA's existence by 107 years? Morrison cleared his throat, his face flushed. No, sir. If your surveys are properly filed and I can see the county recorder stamps, then your easement is legally protected. The HOA would have no authority whatsoever. James removed one final document from his case. This is a cease and desist letter prepared by Brookfield County's property attorney, whom I met with yesterday. It informs the HOA that the chain blocking my fort constitutes illegal obstruction of a documented easement. You have 24 hours to remove all barriers and restore my full access. He placed the letter in front of Patricia, whose face had gone from confident to pale. Additionally, I'm filing a formal complaint with the county regarding abuse of HOA authority and seeking reimbursement for legal fees, survey costs, and damages for restricted property access. The total currently stands at $8,300. Patricia's voice came out as a croak. You can't. The HOA board voted. Your board voted on something they had no legal right to vote on. James said quietly, you attempted to seize private property using a title that grants you exactly zero authority over pre-existing land rights. What you did, Ms. Brennan, is legally actionable. He looked around the room at the other homeowners, many of whom were staring at Patricia with growing anger. I tried explaining this 3 months ago. I tried showing you my documentation. You laughed and told me your authority superseded my property rights. So now, instead of a simple apology and acknowledgement, you're facing legal action, potential removal from your HOA position. and a very expensive lesson in property law. He closed his survey case with a decisive click. The chain comes down tomorrow morning. If it's still there at noon, my attorney files the complaint at the courthouse. Your choice. James walked out of the community center, leaving Patricia Brennan sitting at the head table, surrounded by furious homeowners demanding to know why their HOA president had just cost them potential legal liability. James woke at dawn on September 18th and drove his truck down to the creek ford before his morning coffee. The chain was gone. The posts had been pulled from the creek banks. Even the laminated sign had been removed, leaving only disturbed earth and faint post-hole depressions as evidence that Patricia's territorial grab had ever existed. James stood in the shallow water, early autumn sun glinting off the creek's surface, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His grandfather had built this crossing with his own hands in 1908, laying flat creek stones to create a stable path through water that never rose above 10 inches even in spring floods. 4 generations of Whitakers had used this ford, and Patricia Brennan's 3-month reign of suburban authority had failed to erase what a century of documented history protected. The real reckoning, however, came 2 days later when James received a certified letter from the Brookfield Meadows HOA board. Patricia Brennan had been removed as president by emergency vote effective immediately. The letter, signed by 7 board members, offered formal apologies for the property rights violation and confirmed the HOA would pay James's legal and survey documentation fees in full $8,300 exactly as he calculated. Attached was a separate letter from Patricia herself, 3 paragraphs of stiff, legally coached language acknowledging her misunderstanding of jurisdictional boundaries and regret for any inconvenience caused. The word sorry appeared nowhere in her letter, but the defeat in her formal phrasing was apology enough. The community fallout proved more severe than James had anticipated. Within a week, 3 other longtime residents came forward with their own stories of Patricia's overreach. A homeowner threatened with fines for a vegetable garden predating the HOA. Another cited for a fence that existed 5 years before the subdivision was built. A third pressured to remove solar panels Patricia personally disliked. Each case involved Patricia attempting to extend HOA authority beyond its legal boundaries, banking on people's unwillingness to fight back. James's very public victory at the September 17th meeting had emboldened others to challenge her documentation, and each challenge revealed the same pattern. Patricia had confused her title with actual legal authority. On October 5th, James was working in his shop when he heard a vehicle approaching the ford. He stepped outside to see Patricia's silver sedan parked at the creek's edge, windows up, engine running. She sat behind the wheel for 5 long minutes before finally stepping out. She looked diminished somehow, her earlier aggressive confidence replaced by careful uncertainty. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, not meeting his eyes, "I came to see the property myself. The surveys. The actual boundaries." James studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the creek. "My grandfather laid these stones in 1908. Every survey since then has documented this exact crossing. You could have seen all this 3 months ago if you'd been willing to look at my documentation instead of assuming your position gave you authority you didn't actually have." He paused, then added more gently, "Being in charge doesn't mean you're in charge of everything, Ms. Brennan. Sometimes it just means you're responsible for understanding limits." Patricia nodded slowly, staring at the creek stones worn smooth by a century of use. The board voted to implement mandatory training on property law and HOA jurisdiction limits for everyone, including future presidents. She finally met his eyes. "What you said at that meeting about me confusing authority with rights, that was accurate. I thought the title meant I could fix everything I saw as problems. I was wrong." She drove another word, and James watched the sedan disappear up the county road. He understood that kind of lesson, the hard-earned humility that comes from discovering your assumptions were built on sand. Whether Patricia would actually change or simply become more careful in her overreach, he couldn't predict. But she'd learned one permanent truth. Property rights documented across 117 years don't disappear because someone with a 3-month-old title decides they should. 2 months later, in early December, James stood at the fort during the first snowfall of winter, watching white flakes disappear into creek water that never stopped flowing. His workshop glowed warm behind him, his late wife's garden shed stood peaceful in the distance, and the 5 back acres stretched quiet and undisturbed. The HOA payment had cleared, covering every dollar of his legal preparation. Patricia had resigned from the board entirely, replaced by a retired attorney who'd made his first act a comprehensive boundary review ensuring no property conflicts existed. Other homeowners now greeted James at the local hardware store, thanking him for standing up to overreach they'd been too intimidated to challenge themselves. James Whitaker had learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from avoiding conflict. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly what you own, documenting it thoroughly, and refusing to surrender rights to someone whose authority exists only in their imagination. And as he stood there watching snow dust the century-old creek stones his grandfather had placed with careful hands, he smiled. Because justice, whether delivered through engineering precision or legal documentation, was equally satisfying when it protected what previous generations had built to last. Across the country in Sedona, Arizona, military veteran and retired surveyor, Maria Castellanos was tending her native plant garden when her new neighbor demanded she remove the ugly desert weeds blocking his mountain view. Maria smiled the same patient smile she'd used explaining land rights to confused officers during her 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers and pulled out the conservation easement she established 5 years earlier. "These protected plants were here before your house existed," she said quietly. "Perhaps you'd like to see the federal documentation." Her neighbor's face went white. But that's a story for another time.